The first hiss rose from the darkness of the small wooden darkroom, a faint whispering sound like a coal catching air. Elias Marrow froze mid-motion, his gloved hand suspended above the developing tray. For a moment he thought the noise came from the kettle cooling near the corner stove, but the air was still, heavy with the sweet, metallic scent of silver bromide and vinegar. Then it came again, sharp, alive, and a thin wisp of vapor drifted upward from the plate submerged beneath the chemical bath. The faint outline of the photograph was beginning to appear, its shapes uncertain, ghostly. Elias leaned closer, his breath held, heart thudding with a craftsman's anxious pride. He had spent the entire afternoon capturing that one frame, the wagon, the man, the calm light of midsummer, and now it revealed itself in silver tones that seemed to shimmer with more than daylight. He adjusted the red lantern slightly, and as the shadows shifted, the image sharpened. There was the wagon, the road, the man in his hat, but then something else. In the upper corner, where only sky should be, a sphere of light glimmered. It was not a smudge, nor a stain of chemical error. It was too precise, too deliberate. A second sun, smaller and colder, burning in a way that defied warmth. Elias blinked hard, thinking it a trick of fatigue. He had been awake since dawn, traveling between the fairgrounds and the open fields beyond Alderbridge to capture the countryside under clear weather. But the longer he stared, the clearer the impossible shape became. The plate seemed to pulse faintly, as though the light within it had not yet finished revealing itself. "What in God's name?" he whispered under his breath. His voice trembled not from fear, but disbelief. He had seen fogged negatives, double exposures, even ghostly silhouettes when the glass was reused, but never this. He turned the plate gently, examining the back for cracks or chemical stains. It was flawless. The light on the image remained steady, an orb of pale brilliance that cast no shadow yet seemed to glow against the dark room's red light. The hiss returned, longer now, lower, and for a fleeting second Elias thought he heard something else underneath it, like a murmur. He blinked again, startled, and nearly dropped the plate. He stepped back and drew a long breath, his body trembling. "Calm, Elias. It's the solution, nothing more," he muttered, his voice echoing off the walls. He set the plate down to dry, the emulsion glistening as the image solidified. But as he wiped the sweat from his brow, he caught sight of his own reflection in the metal tongs. His face looked oddly pale, his pupils tight as pinpricks, as though he'd been staring directly into sunlight. He turned away quickly and opened the door to the workshop, letting the cold air flood in. Outside, the evening light was golden and harmless, stretching across the open fields of Norfolk. He stood in the doorway for several minutes, trying to steady himself. Yet, even with the fresh air cooling his skin, the memory of that second sun burned behind his eyes. Later that night, Elias returned to the darkroom. He needed to be sure of what he'd seen. His reputation depended on precision, not superstition. He fetched a magnifying glass and examined the glass plate under lamplight. The orb remained, unmoving, sharp, and impossibly detailed. When he tilted the plate slightly, the light refracted through it, revealing faint rings around the smaller sun, like ripples frozen in time. "It can't be," he whispered. He compared it against the positioning of the wagon and the man, every shadow consistent, every proportion exact. The sun in the sky, visible in the photo's upper left, was where it should be. Yet this other light hovered lower, near the horizon line, as if the world had briefly mirrored itself. The following morning, Elias visited the village chemist, a wiry man named Harold Fincher, who had sold him the latest photographic compounds imported from London. He laid the plate on the counter, wrapped in a cloth. "Look closely," he said, unwrapping it with care. Fincher squinted through his spectacles, then frowned. "You've double-exposed it," he declared. "You must have loaded another negative over the first." Elias shook his head. "I'm certain I did not." It was a single plate. New, cleaned twice. I checked the holder myself. Fincher's tone softened slightly, but his eyes were skeptical. Then it's an error in your shutter timing, perhaps a flare from the primary light. The summer haze can play tricks on glass. Elias studied the chemist's expression and felt the subtle sting of dismissal. Would haze leave reflection? He asked quietly, turning the plate so that the chemist could see the faint mirrored glow within the subject's watch face. Fincher's brow furrowed. He adjusted his spectacles again, leaning closer until his breath fogged the surface of the glass. Strange, he muttered. That shouldn't be there. The reflection was unmistakable. The smaller sun captured again, perfectly round within the watch's crystal surface. It even showed a slight offset from the main light source, as though the two orbs had hung side by side in the same sky. Fincher straightened up, unease creeping into his voice. Keep this between us, Marrow. Such things draw attention of the wrong sort. The Royal Society men would tear it apart, but word had already begun to spread. By evening, several of Elias's apprentices had whispered about the photograph. Some said the chemicals had burned white-hot, others claimed they'd seen smoke rising from the tray. One boy, pale and trembling, insisted he heard the plate hum like a tuning fork. Elias dismissed their gossip, though he couldn't shake the feeling that something in his studio had changed, like a sound lingering after silence. He worked late that night, checking each chemical mixture, every shutter gear, every glass pane, and found nothing amiss. And yet, when he closed his eyes, he still saw it. Two suns, one bright and golden, the other pale and hollow, circling each other like twin ghosts over the Norfolk fields. The next few days brought sleepless nights. Elias dreamed of light that folded and refolded until it became sound, and of voices whispering through the cracks in the dark-room door. When he awoke, his skin felt cold, as though he had been standing beneath that impossible light. His friends urged him to rest, but he refused. The negative had to be real. There had to be an explanation. He documented every step, his notes growing frantic. No damage to lens. No moisture. Light divided. Heat absent. He planned to send the plate to London for examination, but before he could pack it safely, another thought gripped him, one that made his blood run cold. What if the camera had not merely captured light, but something that did not belong to their world at all? On the 7th day after the photograph was taken, Elias stood again in the darkroom, the image before him gleaming faintly even without light. He touched the edge of the glass, and a sudden pulse of warmth spread across his fingers. He dropped it instinctively, watching as it landed flat on the table without breaking. For a long moment, he simply stared. The second sun seemed to pulse in rhythm with his own heartbeat, slow and steady. It was no illusion. It was alive with something he did not understand. He sank into his chair, exhausted, fear and fascination twisting together in his chest. "No one will believe it," he whispered. His voice was thin, almost childlike, and yet, somewhere deep down, he knew belief wasn't the point. Whatever this light was, it had already left its mark, on the glass, on the air, on him. By the time the Royal Photographic Review requested the plate for study, Elias Marrow had vanished. No one since has taken a picture where daylight folds upon itself. The day after Elias Marrow's disappearance, the small village of Alderbridge seemed quieter than usual, as if the very air carried the memory of his last photograph. A faint odor of burnt chemicals still clung to the narrow lane that led to his workshop, a modest brick building tucked behind the churchyard. The door was ajar, one hinge blackened, and the smell that drifted through was a mix of vinegar, scorched metal, and something less identifiable, like air struck by lightning. Inside, a constable named Robert Timmins stood in the doorway, hat in hand, squinting against the thin beam of daylight that cut through the cracked window. He had been sent to record the details of Marrow's sudden absence. The floor was littered with shards of glass that caught the light like tiny mirrors, arranged in an almost perfect circle near the darkroom table. The copper basin that Marrow used for developing plates was overturned, its contents congealed into a dull, gray crust. Dr. Bernard Keene arrived moments later, summoned not by law, but by curiosity. A tall, narrow-faced man in his 50s, Keene had treated Marrow just a week earlier. His boots clicked softly on the tiles as he entered, eyes scanning the strange display. "Same odor as before," he murmured, leaning toward the circle of glass. "Burnt, but no flame." Constable Timmons frowned. "You said he was unwell last you saw him, Doctor?" Keene nodded slowly. "Exhausted." Spoke of a divided sun, claimed his vision had turned double after a long exposure. Yet his eyes were perfectly sound. He paused, recalling the faint tremor in Marrow's hands, the way the man had clutched his temples as if trying to hold his thoughts in place. He was frightened, not mad. "There's a difference." The two men stood in silence as the light shifted across the floor, illuminating the edges of the circle. Timmons bent down and traced the outline with his gloved finger. The soot left a faint residue, fine as ash but strangely warm to the touch. "It's as though the heat came from inside the glass," he said. Keene looked toward the window, where the sun hung pale and ordinary over the church steeple. "Whatever he captured that day," he said quietly, "it left a mark that the world wasn't meant to see." Outside, the town went about its routine, unaware of the small investigation taking shape behind Holland and Sons Optical Works. The shopkeeper, Arthur Holland, was one of the last to see Marrow alive. When questioned, he described the tradesman's visit in simple terms. Elias had come to purchase new plates and a vial of silver nitrate. "He looked worn," Holland said, wiping his hands on his apron. "Eyes hollow. Told me he'd caught something in the sky, something that shouldn't be there." I thought he meant a bird that night. In the quiet of his clinic, Dr. Keene opened his ledger and made a final note on Marrow's case. The entry was brief but deliberate. Patient reports seeing double light after exposure, eyes uninjured. He closed the book slowly, feeling the weight of what he could not explain. In the weeks that followed, talk of the second son drifted through the taverns and along the cobbled streets of Alderbridge. Some dismissed it as gossip. Others claimed that on certain days, when the clouds parted just right, a faint white circle could be seen beside the real sun, as though the sky itself carried a scar. The parish council issued no statement, though Reverend Whitcomb mentioned during one sermon that the heavens have their secrets, and not all are meant for man to decipher. When the summer fairs arrived, no one mentioned Marrow's name. His studio remained closed, its windows boarded by order of the magistrate. Only the faint scent of burnt silver lingered on the wind near the churchyard path. Then came the constable's memorandum. Filed in August, it described the site in precise, methodical language. No evidence of fire, no signs of struggle. A burnt odor persists. Glass fragments arranged deliberately, forming a circle. The report was signed and sealed, then quietly set aside, as though no one wanted to be the one to reopen it. Yet the village never truly forgot. Men whispered of strange lights seen over the marshes at dusk, and fishermen spoke of reflections on the water that did not move with the sun. Dr. Keene, burdened by the memory of his patient, began to question the limits of his own science. One evening, he stood outside his cottage, notebook in hand, watching the horizon. The sunset blazed orange and red, but just above it, he thought he saw a pale shimmer, faint but steady, like a ghost of daylight. He blinked, and it was gone. Weeks later, he returned to the workshop one last time. The boards creaked under his boots as he stepped inside, lantern trembling in his grasp. Dust coated everything now. The circle of scorched glass was still there, untouched, undisturbed. He crouched beside it, feeling a chill that seemed to rise from the floor itself. "What did you see, Elias?" he whispered. "And where did it take you?" A faint breeze stirred through the cracks, carrying with it a whispering hum, a sound like distant wires vibrating, though there were none in Alderbridge. The doctor turned toward the noise, but there was only the dark-room door, slightly open, and the dim outline of the broken camera resting on the table. When he stepped outside, dawn was breaking. The first rays of morning light touched the village roofs, ordinary and warm, and yet, as the sunlight spilled through the trees, Dr. Keene swore for an instant that it seemed to bend, just slightly, as though refracted by something invisible. The official records would later list Elias Marrow as missing, presumed deceased. The cause was left blank. The community, perhaps out of fear or fatigue, accepted his absence without protest. Children played near the old studio without knowing its story. Only a few elders remembered the man who once photographed the fairs, the fields, and, some said, the impossible. In the end, Alderbridge moved on. The chemist reopened, the lanes brightened again under gaslight, and the world continued spinning beneath its single sun. But in the quiet corners of the parish, where dust gathered on forgotten ledgers and memories lingered like smoke, the question remained, what had Elias Marrow truly captured that day? And what price had it demanded? The official explanation, that of lens failure, never accounted for the second reflection. The lock clicked with a tired groan as Thomas Ray pushed open the door to Elias Marrow's abandoned studio. Dust swirled in the thin slice of daylight that crept through the narrow window, carrying the faint, acrid scent of chemical residue. The air inside was stale, heavy with the ghost of recent work, the faint sweetness of ether, the metallic tang of silver nitrate, and something else beneath it, something scorched. Ray hesitated on the threshold, his fingers tightening around the key. It had been nearly 3 weeks since anyone had stepped foot in this room, and even the floorboards seemed reluctant to welcome him back. He was only 20, an apprentice still learning the delicate balance between precision and patience that photography demanded. Marrow had been his mentor, though their last meeting was uneasy. The older man had spoken little that day, his hands trembling as he packed the last of his glass plates into a wooden crate. "Keep the studio locked until I return," he had said, voice low but urgent. "If I do not return, record what you find, but touch nothing until you understand what you're touching." Now, as Ray set down his ledger and stepped deeper into the room, he could feel the weight of those words settle over him like a shroud. The darkroom door hung slightly ajar. He pushed it open and found the brass Thornton and Pickard shutter still mounted to the tripod. The lever was frozen mid-motion. The metal warped as though it had melted and solidified again within seconds. On the workbench beside it lay Marrow's journal, open to a half-filled page. Ray brushed away a thin layer of soot to read the entries, times, temperatures, light conditions, each line meticulously written in the older man's precise hand. 1306, 1307, 1308, sky clear, he murmured to himself, eyes narrowing. The next line was scrawled hastily, the ink darker, pressed hard into the paper. Light divided, heat absent. He frowned, feeling a faint chill run down his arms despite the summer air pressing against the window pane. Beside the journal, a pair of tongs rested crookedly atop a cracked plate tray. He reached for them, intending to shift them aside, but the moment his fingers made contact, a low hum vibrated through the metal, traveling up into his palm like the faint pulse of a live wire. He dropped them instinctively, heart hammering. "There's no electricity here," he whispered, half to himself, half to the silent room. He knelt to examine the tongs again, this time using the edge of a cloth to lift them. The vibration ceased as soon as the metal left the tabletop. His mind raced through possibilities, residual heat, chemical reaction, magnetism, but none fit. There were no electric lines in Alderbridge, no reason for the sensation he had felt. He placed the tongs carefully aside and opened the storage cabinet. Inside were glass negatives, each neatly labeled in Marrow's hand. Only one stood out, a plate marked J14. Its edges were blackened as though it had been too near a flame, yet the center gleamed faintly, reflecting a muted double light even in the dimness. Ray turned toward the window to catch more sun. As he lifted the plate, an odd thing happened. The sunlight refracted through it not once but twice, producing a second glimmer that shimmered across the opposite wall. He blinked, uncertain if his eyes deceived him, then turned the plate slightly. Both lights moved independently, one bright and warm, the other cold and colorless, its glow faintly blue. He stood frozen, breath shallow. "It shows noon and midnight together," came a voice from behind. Startled, Ray spun around to find Reverend Copley, the parish vicar, standing in the doorway. The older man had come at Ray's request, curious to assist in documenting the late photographer's effects for the church's records. His face, half hidden in shadow, was pale with awe. "That cannot be right," he murmured, stepping closer. "The sun cannot divide itself." Ray turned the plate again, showing him the shifting light. "It's the same in every angle. No trick glass, no layering. And this," he gestured to the warped shutter mechanism. "It's as though the metal fused in a flash." But there was no fire, no lightning. The vicar crossed himself quietly. Then perhaps the fire came from elsewhere. They stood in silence for a long moment, the hum of summer insects barely reaching through the window's thin glass. Then Ray placed the plate back on the bench and closed Marrow's journal. "I'll send this to the Gazette," he said, though doubt edged his voice. "They can make sense of it." But even as he said the words, he knew the editors would dismiss it as technical error, perhaps double exposure. And yet, something before leaving, Ray recorded his findings carefully in the ledger: the warped shutter, the unusual vibration, the light anomaly. But as he wrote, the ink began to bleed slightly, darkening at the edges as if drawn toward the final line of Marrow's journal. Light divided, heat absent. He stopped, hand trembling, a single drop of sweat rolling down his temple. For an instant, he thought he saw a second shadow of his own hand reflected on the table, a faint, translucent echo mimicking his movement half a second too late. He blinked, and it vanished. By evening, the Norfolk Gazette would report the day as temperate with thin cirrus. Nothing out of the ordinary. Yet when Ray later examined the emulsion under lamplight, it bore the marks of severe overexposure, a contradiction that made no sense under such calm skies. He locked the studio once more, leaving behind the plate, the tongs, and the notebook. But as he stepped into the fading sunlight, the world seemed strangely dim, like daylight viewed through smoked glass. In the weeks to come, the phrase spoken by Reverend Copley would return to him often, whispered in dreams and echoed in official inquiries long after. "It shows noon and midnight together." That phrase would later echo through every official inquiry. The photograph reappeared without warning. On a damp spring evening in 1891, the Harrow Photographic Society prepared for its annual exhibition, filling the high-ceilinged hall with rows of polished glass frames and the faint odor of varnish and lamp oil. Among the submissions laid upon the oak table was an unmarked parcel wrapped in rough black paper. It bore no return address, only the initials E.M. faintly penciled on one corner. When the clerk unwrapped it, he found a glass plate, old, brittle, and faintly iridescent, bearing a label in spidery handwriting: Alderbridge, 1888. The plate was placed under a gas lamp for inspection. What the committee saw at first seemed ordinary: a countryside field, a wagon, a solitary man. But then someone leaned closer. "There are two suns," murmured the clerk, his voice breaking the quiet. The room fell still. Even the ticking of the wall clock seemed to hesitate. No one spoke again until Professor Edwin Rawle, chair of optics at Calderley College, arrived later that evening to authenticate the entry. In the air of that studio defied dismissal. Rawl was a tall, exacting man with silvered hair and spectacles that caught every reflection. He had spent his career studying lens diffraction and exposure timing, dismissing the era's growing fascination with spirit photography. Yet, as he adjusted the brass ransom photometer over the plate, his expression shifted from skepticism to unease. The device's needle flickered twice, stabilizing on two distinct readings of light intensity. "That is not possible," he muttered under his breath. He repositioned the photometer, repeated the test, and received the same result. Two luminous centers, separated by precisely 4.3 degrees, registered on the scale. He straightened slowly, his hands trembling slightly against the wooden counter. "It's not a double exposure," he said finally, his tone low but urgent. "The alignment is geometrically impossible for a single lens." The others in the room exchanged uncertain glances. The clerk whispered, "Should we disqualify it?" Rawl shook his head. "No, we must understand it first." He signed his initials on the examination card and requested that the plate be sent to the Royal Institute of Optics for advanced testing. That decision would soon haunt him. Within days, the glass plate was delivered to Dr. Lucian Tarrow, a chemical analyst known for his meticulous studies on silver bromide reactions. Tarrow worked alone in a laboratory that smelled of ether and steel polish, the gas flames from his burners flickering blue in the half-dark. He placed the mysterious plate beneath a magnifying lamp and examined the emulsion with a loupe. The silver grains shimmered faintly, pulsing as if alive. He recorded his first impression in his notebook. "Unprecedented fatigue across silver compound, similar to solarization, but pattern irregular. Possibly struck by alternating waveforms." The phrase he later coined, "solar silver fatigue," would appear in no other report in photographic history. Late into the night, he prepared a controlled exposure test, using a newly coated plate and the same type of lens Marrow had once owned. He tried to replicate the phenomenon through double exposure, refracted mirrors, even candlelight interference. None matched the eerie duality of Marrow's original. Exhausted, he leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. That was when he noticed something impossible. The second sun, smaller and sharper than the first, appeared to have shifted position. Only slightly, by a fraction of an inch, but enough that when he compared it to his earlier sketch, the difference was clear. He adjusted the magnifier again, heart pounding. "You're not fixed, are you?" he whispered, as though speaking to the plate itself. Moments later, the gaslight flickered violently, dimming the room. The temperature dropped. The thermometer on the wall dipped 5 degrees in less than a minute. A faint hum rose from the glass plate, soft at first, then steady, vibrating like the string of a struck instrument. Tarrow stumbled backward, his sleeve brushing a tray of glass rods that clattered to the floor. He watched in silence as a pale sheen rippled across the emulsion, like moonlight seen through deep water. When the light returned to normal, the second sun had dimmed again, but not vanished. Shaken, Tarrow wrapped the plate carefully in black velvet and sealed it in a box. His report to Professor Rawl was brief. Photochemical properties unstable. Possible alternating wavelength interference. Recommend containment until further study. Days later, the Harrow Society received the plate back, along with Tarrow's findings. The curator, Mr. August Fenley, reviewed the report under the yellow glow of his office lamp. His hands trembled slightly as he turned the last page. "Alternating wavelengths," he repeated softly. "One visible, one inverted." He stared at the photograph on his desk, the image of two suns, one bright and alive, the other pale and ghost-like, and felt a cold unease settle over him. That evening, the plate was placed on public display in a locked glass cabinet for the exhibition's opening. Visitors gathered, drawn by whispers of a second sun. The hall filled with murmurs and the clicking of pocket watches. Some claimed they saw the smaller sun shift faintly as they watched, as though it existed not within the glass, but behind it. Others said it seemed to pulse, slow and deliberate, like a heartbeat. Fenley ordered the exhibit closed before midnight. "Cover it," he commanded the attendants, voice sharp with fear. "Seal it at once." They obeyed, draping the cabinet in black cloth while curious onlookers protested. The curator's heart thudded in his chest as he locked the case and placed the key in his coat pocket. "We are not meant to show this," he muttered. When the last visitor left and the gaslights dimmed, Fenley entered his office and sent a telegraph to London. His fingers hesitated above the keys before he typed the message that would vanish from the records. "Duplicate star observed again. Advise containment." The telegram was logged, stamped, and later, mysteriously, erased from the archive index. By morning, no one spoke of the photograph again. Rahl's measurements, Tarrow's notes, and Fenley's report were quietly withdrawn from circulation. The official record listed the incident as a clerical error, but those who had seen the plate remembered the shimmer in its depths and the strange vibration in the floorboards as they covered it. Each man, in his own way, came to the same unspoken conclusion that something had entered the frame that did not belong to their world. Each expert confirmed the anomaly's reality, and each withdrew their report. The meeting room of the Harrow Institute of Optics was lit only by the pale glow of a single gas lamp, its light wavering across the polished oak table where the photograph lay under a magnifying lens. Professor Edwin Rahl leaned forward, his brow tense, hands clasped as though afraid to touch the glass. Across from him sat Dr. Lucien Tarrow, the Royal Institute's leading chemical analyst, a man known for his rigid skepticism. Between them, the image of the second sun shimmered faintly, as if the glass held breath. "It cannot be a reflection," Rahl said, his voice low but certain. "No mirror, no double lens. It's within the emulsion itself." He adjusted the photometer, the brass frame catching the dim light. The wavelength spread shows separation, precisely 4.3 degrees. "That's no accident." Tarrow frowned, the flame's reflection dancing in his spectacles. "You speak as if the plate were conscious," he muttered. "Light does not divide without cause. It obeys law. Law does not bend itself to mystery." Rahl looked up sharply. "And yet, here we are," he replied, his tone tinged with both frustration and awe. He tapped the edge of the photograph gently. "The alignment matches no existing exposure. If this were a reused plate, we would see trace patterns, edges, chemical ghosts, but there's nothing. It's as though the glass itself caught two different skies in a single instant." For a long while, neither man spoke. Outside, rain began to fall softly against the leaded windows. The silence felt heavy, charged. It was Tarrow who finally broke it. "Suppose," he began slowly, "the subject manipulated the plate. Scratched it, etched it perhaps. Fraud for fame." Rahl gave a short, humorless laugh. "Marrow?" The tradesman with trembling hands and no formal training? "Hardly. Besides, the chemical tests refute it. No incision, no pigment. The surface is pure. I've seen forgeries. They lie flat. This image breathes. Tarrow's gaze lingered on the pale twin suns frozen in silver nitrate. "Then, what do you call it?" Rahl hesitated before answering. "An interference," he said softly, "but not optical, temporal." The word hung between them, fragile and forbidden. In the following weeks, debates rippled through the scientific community. The Royal Photographic Review published cautious editorials calling the image an instructive curiosity. Private letters circulated, speculating about exposure errors or chemical contamination. Yet, beneath the surface, a growing unease spread among those who had studied the plate firsthand. Reports from Norfolk described sudden crop failure that summer, fields bleached as though caught under frost in the middle of June. Farmers claimed the light had changed, pale and cold, casting two shadows where there should have been one. At the Harrow Institute, Rawl and Tarot continued their analysis late into the nights. The smell of collodion and dust filled the laboratory, mingling with the tension between reason and dread. "There was lightning near Alderbridge, wasn't there?" Tarot asked one evening as he poured a sample of developer into a porcelain tray. "Residual current could have imprinted a ghost exposure." Rawl shook his head. "No records. Not a single storm within 50 miles that week." The sky was clear. He paused, lowering his voice. But several witnesses reported something else, an odd stillness. Birds silent. The wind reversed direction for several minutes. Then, nothing. Tarot's hands trembled slightly as he placed the photograph under a new lens. "Do you ever feel," he whispered, "that we are studying something that doesn't wish to be understood?" Rawl looked up, startled by the admission. He had felt it too, that the plate seemed to look back, that its faint hum at certain angles was more than the sound of settling glass. Yet he said nothing. Science demanded silence where superstition began. Rumors spread of a new theory circulating among spiritualists, one they called the Mirror Hour. They believed that for a brief moment each century the world recorded itself twice, once in light and once in its reflection beyond time. A journalist from the London Courier wrote mockingly of ghost suns and fractured hours, but his editor later retracted the piece, citing editorial sensitivity. The public lost interest. The experts, however, could not. When Rawl returned to Calderley College, he found a sealed envelope waiting in his study. Inside was a single photograph, the same image, but the man's reflection in the pocket watch was subtly changed. The figure's eyes, open in the original, were now closed. He examined it under every possible condition: candlelight, magnifier, gas lamp. The anomaly persisted. He wrote to Tarot that very night, the pen trembling in his hand. "The reflection has altered." Whether this is optical degradation or interference of another nature, I cannot yet say, but I fear it is still developing. Weeks later, when the Harrow Society convened for their quarterly session, both men presented their findings to a hushed audience. The theories clashed like thunder in that small hall. Rawl spoke of temporal dissonance, suggesting the photograph had captured a moment displaced from its proper time. Tarot countered fiercely with talk of static charge and exposure accidents. Others dismissed both, calling for reason and restraint. But reason faltered beneath the evidence before them. By the meeting's end, the board voted to withdraw the paper entirely from publication. No one wanted their name attached to it. The official record would note no conclusive result. Outside the building, Rawl stood beneath the iron lamps, his breath visible in the chill night air. "Light divided," he murmured, recalling Marrow's final journal line. "Heat absent." He looked up at the overcast sky where the moon hid behind clouds and, for an instant, thought he saw a faint, pale echo beside it, smaller, colder, and burning in reverse. He closed his eyes, shaken but resolute. The phenomenon had not ended with the photograph. It had only begun to reveal itself. In the weeks that followed, both men ceased their correspondence. Rawl withdrew from public life, while Tarot destroyed his chemical notes. Theories multiplied, but none satisfied. Some insisted Marrow had glimpsed a second sun. Others believed he had opened a door that refused to close. When the file was finally archived at the Royal Institute, the label was written in a careful, trembling hand. The file was marked Phenomenon Unresolved. At exactly 3:17 a.m. on the cold morning of November 9, 1888, the silence inside the Harrow Museum was broken by a faint cracking sound, sharp, deliberate, unnatural. The night watchman, Elijah Brandt, had just completed his round on the upper floor when he paused at the top of the stairs. A low, steady vibration thrummed beneath his boots. He frowned, gripping the iron railing. The sensation was not thunder nor wind. It felt internal, like a tremor beneath the skin of the building. Downstairs, in the storage vault beneath the west wing, a crate sealed since the summer groaned faintly and split at the edges. Inside was the glass plate photograph once taken by Elias Marrow, wrapped in black velvet, stored under lock and archival protocol. No one had requested it for over a year. No one had touched it. Elijah descended, lantern in hand, the metal frame trembling faintly with each step. The scent hit him as he approached the basement. Sharp, chemical, acrid, burnt magnesium. He froze at the threshold. That smell belonged in laboratories and flash trays, not a museum's stone cellar. The door to Vault 3 was slightly ajar. He pushed it open, heart thudding. The crate lay in splinters across the floor. Velvet fragments curled outward like scorched leaves. The photograph's glass plate sat upright against the wall, untouched but fogged over, clouded white like breath on a window pane. And yet, in the center of the opacity, 2 discs glowed faintly, one larger, one smaller, neither painted nor etched, but suspended within the emulsion like trapped suns. "Who's there?" Elijah called out, voice taut, searching the corners. No reply came. By the time the curators arrived at first light, the air in the vault was brittle with cold. A brass thermometer mounted near the door read 12 degrees below ambient, a drop impossible without refrigeration. The plate's temperature, when tested, was colder still, and the lights, those twin orbs, remained. Harrison Doyle, the museum's chief conservator, examined the artifact with practiced precision. "The fog is natural, condensation, or age," he muttered, but even he hesitated when he passed a magnifier over the twin discs. "They don't sit on the glass. They sit in it." A full battery of tests followed. Exposure to heat, dry air, and chemical rehydration produced no change. The fog would not lift. The discs would not shift. The museum director, wary of public panic and reputational risk, ordered the exhibit sealed with a warning. "Optical contamination, do not handle." Privately, the staff admitted no known compound could mimic the effect. For decades, the incident slipped into quiet archive. Then, in 1954, during a national digitization initiative, a young archivist named Nora Henning uncovered the file while scanning fragile 19th-century negatives into acetate sleeves. She flagged it immediately due to the label's unusual caution. When she slid the film under the digitizer's lamp, she paused. The scan revealed the image as expected. Wagon, man, sky. But the 2 discs remained, not as marks, but as illuminated blemishes, burning faintly behind the protective sleeve. Her report included only one typed sentence. "The second sun still burns faintly, even through acetate." Weeks later, 2 additional negatives surfaced in private collections, both from 1888, both from rural counties dozens of miles from Alderbridge, both capturing similar scenes of open countryside with unexplained light distortions near the upper edge of the frame. The timestamps on the exposure ledgers, one taken at 1306, the other at 1310, matched nearly to the minute with Marrow's original log. 1307, sky clear. A third plate appeared in 1979, in the estate sale of a retired schoolteacher who'd never owned a camera. Found sealed inside a book cover, it bore the date. June 14, 1888. Today, one restored scan, Marrow's plate, can be viewed inside the Caldwell Institute's virtual gallery. Visitors can toggle filters, test simulated exposures, and examine overlays. Yet no tool has removed the anomaly, and none have replicated it. Optical physicists argue for exposure anomalies. Historians insist on lens fault, but a growing group of theorists, digital and academic alike, propose something more disturbing. Not a defect, not a trick, a glimpse, a brief breach. "A fracture in time," one guest lecturer wrote in the digital comment log. What the camera captured wasn't just the sky. It was a horizon, folding. The question lingers like fog inside the frame. What if every photograph is not just a frozen moment, but a pane of reality, thinner than we think? What if the world behind the lens continues to shift, and sometimes, rarely, it bleeds through? No one has found Elias Marrow. No one has ever taken another image like his. But every year, on June 14th, at 13:07 precisely, a faint pulse of static is recorded on the Institute's sensors. The second sun still waits. If cases like this fascinate you, subscribe and turn on notifications for the next file. Disclaimer: this script is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, institutions, and incidents are invented or used fictitiously. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental, created solely for entertainment.